All right. Well, good morning. It is good to be with you today. This is our last session, session 6 of this study called Seculosity. It's based on a book of the same name by a guy named David Zoll. Annie, you've got your copy with you today. Hold that up for it. Look at that. It's the exact same as my title slide because I may or may not have stolen the image from the title of the book, or the front cover of the book. But it is. This is a study based on this book by David Zoll. And David Zoll's central thesis in this book is that even though, statistically, organized religion is is sort of on the decline in the United States, his argument is that we are actually more religious than ever. It is just that we have shifted our religious impulse, our capital R religious impulse, onto lowercase r secular, or lowercase r secular thing. Secular doesn't start with R, does it? This is how Palm Sunday is affecting me already. To lowercase r religions out of secular things. And secular things, which he goes to great lengths to say are not bad things, right? These are not bad things, but we have found ways of turning them into religions and seeking our sense of transcendence and ultimate fulfillment and purpose, what he calls our enoughness, okay? We seek our enoughness in each of those things. And so each week we've talked about how that dynamic plays out in everything from our work, right? You are what you do, except that you're not, right? That's what we talked about, that we're not what we do, but we talk as if we are, finding our sense of transcendence and purpose in our work, our busyness, our leisure time, our relationship to what we eat, our relationship to one another. We talked about how this dynamic plays out in our romantic relationships as well as just any kind of relationship that we have, really. We talked about how technology plays a part in all of this and how the ways that we connect with one another, the ways that we measure things now is we have more measurements about ourselves than we ever did before, from how many friends we have to how many likes we get to how many steps we take to how what our sleep cycles are, right? I talked about how I don't have an Apple Watch, and that is particularly because I don't want it to know that much about me. My phone already has enough on me, okay? I've always laughed, too, because and it'll probably happen here in about 3 or 4 minutes. For whatever reason, during this class is when my iPad always decides to give me my screen time update for the week. And it is always a very convicting thing to be talking to you about these dynamics and see that pop up and be like, cool, there it is in action, okay? And so we've talked about all of these things, including last week, for those of you who were here last week, we talked about the seculosity of politics even, and how politics has become a way in which we seek to find transcendence and fulfillment and how these things work. And anyway, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, to finish us out, we're going to talk about the seculosity of Jesusland and what we can do about it. So this is actually the final chapter. Jesusland is David Zoll's term. It's not mine, and we'll define it here in a second. And then the conclusion is what we can do about it, and I've kind of combined them into this one session for today. But like always, we're going to begin by talking about what do we mean when we talk about seculosity, because I love this book, and I think David Zoll is a good writer. I think he's very perceptive, but also he makes up a whole lot of words, one of them being seculosity, and so let's talk about that. Just a reminder. My screen report just popped up. I'm so glad it doesn't pop up for you. It was up 13% last week for an average of, I'm not going to tell you how much per day. That's what it said. Okay. I got to figure out how to make it stop doing that during Sunday school. I feel like that's God just like ribbing me. You know what I mean? Okay, all right. So seculosity is a catch-all for religiosity that's directed horizontally rather than vertically, at earthly rather than heavenly objects, right? So this is David Zoll's term for what we do is we seek all of the things that traditionally we would seek to find in church, we've started to find in other places. And David Zoll's point is, and not with a good result. We often end up feeling pretty worn down, pretty despairing, because we can never measure up. We can never measure up. Okay, and so he calls this seculosity. There's this other term that we've talked a lot about that we'll touch on today called performanceism. Another word that David Zoll comes up with. But performanceism is the assumption, usually unspoken, that there is no distinction between what we do and who we are. So this idea that we are defined by our ability to perform, right? That's what makes us who we are, and that also gives us our worth. And when we're performing at our best, when we're on our A game, we use this to justify ourselves, right? David Zoll's all about this. What we're looking for are self-justifying narratives. Narratives that give not only our life purpose, but also allow us to sort of understand and define our own existence. Self-justifying narratives. Now, he notes that performanceism is dangerous because it holds that if you're not doing enough, or if you're not doing enough things well, that you are not enough, right? That you are not enough. And it turns life into a competition to be won, or a problem to be solved, he writes, as opposed to, say, a series of moments to be experienced or an adventure to relish. I mean, how many of you have felt this before, right? Where your drive to perform in whatever way starts to make life less of an experience that you're kind of living and more of this game that you're keeping score on. You know, we talked about this significantly in our relationships with other people, right? When you start scorekeeping, especially in your marriage, that's always a recipe for disaster. Nobody wins that game. That's my thing. Nobody wins that game. But we can do it in every aspect of our lives. It invests daily tasks, David Zoll writes, with existential significance, and it turns even menial activities into measures of our enoughness. The language of performanceism is the language of scorekeeping, and just like the weight scale or the calendar, it knows no mercy. Okay, that's what he says. But I think it's right. Performanceism can just drive you into the ground, and we see it in all facets of our life today. So what are we talking about today? Well, we've been talking about how we've displaced this religious impulse onto all of these other aspects of our lives, from our work to our technology to our relationship with food, our relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the church is not immune. The church is not immune to these same dynamics that David Zoll's been laying out throughout the book. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is what happens when seculosity comes to church. Okay? And I'm just going to put all of these points up there and let you read them. I've got better slides today. Some weeks my slides aren't that great. Today we've got good slides that that summarize each thing. But okay, so he talks about the dilemma of Jesusland. And he's basically setting up this dichotomy between works righteousness and the grace of the gospel. Okay, this is kind of where he's been going throughout the entirety of the book, but he starts talking about it in relationship to the church. He says on page 163 of the book, if seculosity refers to religious energy directed at secular or horizontal targets, why even talk about the church? You would presume that religion is exempt from our diagnosis. But the tragic irony of Jesusland, which he defines as the not altogether flattering way of referring to the form of Protestant Christianity that dominates so much of the spiritual landscape in the West. This is what he means when he says Jesusland, right? He says the tragic irony of Jesusland is that it often resembles its secular replacements more than the, quote, real thing with a capital R, capital T. So that church starts to look more like the religiosity that we've been describing in all of these other chapters. And this entire study has been about different ways that we seek to find transcendence and ultimate fulfillment from things that aren't traditional capital R religions. And all of these replacement religions offer in a religion of law. For example, if you eat well enough, or if you work hard enough, or if you rest well enough, or if you parent your children well enough and in the right ways, you will be enough. If you can just fulfill the law of all of these things, whatever those things are, you've done it. You've won. You've won the game, right? In the scorekeeping way of thinking about things. David Zoll writes that a small R religion of law promises functional salvation to those who live up to its demands, expressed more often than not in the shoulds and oughts that we infer from our shared ideals. For instance, thou ought to be skinny or influential or effortlessly sophisticated, and so on, if you want to be accepted, respected, or admired. End quote. But, as David Zoll points out, there's a fundamental problem with all religions of law in whatever form that we encounter them. The problem does not reside in the content of the law itself, he says. The problem resides in the human heart. Knowing what we should do or should be does not give us the ability to do or be those things, not when it really comes down to it. And I think for me, this is kind of the central point, right? Knowing the way that, for instance, I should probably eat hadn't stopped me from eating the way that I do, right? Or knowing that I should exercise hasn't stopped me from drinking a beer instead, right? I know what I should do, and yet that doesn't give me what I need to actually do that thing, whatever it is, even if I know I should be doing it. How many of you can relate? Hopefully. Good. Yeah, me too. Okay. Now, we're in good company. If you could relate to that you know what you probably should be doing, but you don't do it anyway, we're in good company because St. Paul understood this. He writes as much in Romans 7. There's a famous passage that if you read the whole thing, it'll twist you in knots because he's like, I do what I don't want to do, and I do what I do, and I don't do, and I do. But there's one central verse, okay? Romans 7, verse 15. He says, I do not understand my own actions, Paul writes. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. How many of you have done that, right? It's like, I want to be living this way, and yet for whatever reason, I am living this way. And I understand it, I see it, and yet nothing changes, right? Like I just keep living that way. I mean, Paul's writing about this in the first century. This isn't new, this isn't novel, but it still persists in these different ways in our culture today. And so David Zoll writes, religions of law may succeed in the short term because they appeal to our yearning for control. Remember, we talked about this a lot when it comes to parenting. One of the reasons that we become so religious and zealous about whatever approach to parenting you may have adopted is because it gives us the sense of control, that we can somehow engineer our children. And as anyone who's ever had children knows, you absolutely cannot engineer them. They will do their own thing because they are people, not robots, and you can only try your best, right? So what religions of law do is they do give us a sense of control. But they run out of steam eventually, David Zoll writes, when confronted with the realities of human conflictedness or human nature. Furthermore, enough, this idea that we can be enough, that we can reach enough, turns out to be a mirage, right? Because it always is retreating in the distance, this idea that we can be enough. The goalposts just keep moving each time you get close, each time you get close. Religions of law promise wholeness and peace, he says, but as all of the preceding chapters illustrate, they ultimately deliver anxiety, self-consciousness, and loneliness. He says a culture awash in seculosity is therefore a culture of despair, he says. Culture of despair, which sounds pretty bleak, and maybe it is, but I also kind of just think maybe we don't feel despairing all the time, but I do think that is the sort of place where many of us live. If you can't ever be enough and you can't ever quite measure up, there's really only, you either like resign yourself to never being enough, that sounds kind of like despair, right? Like, boo. Or you just strive so hard to be enough that you run yourself into the ground. That also sounds like despair. I think this is one place where Zoll is kind of right, as harsh as it sounds. Anytime you encounter a culture awash in seculosity, it is a culture of despair. So, what happens? What do we need? Well, in every chapter, right, the end of the chapter, you probably, if you've been here more than a couple of these weeks, you've seen that these follow a pattern. He lays out the problem, and the solution's always grace. It's always grace. Now, grace may look different in each chapter, but it's always grace. And so let's talk about the gift of grace this morning. Because this is when he's talking specifically about the church. He says Christianity offers, or should at least offer, something different. Now, he makes it clear that Christianity is not a faith devoid of law, and we know this, right? We know this. We're not a faith devoid of law. Far from it, right? God is actually the one who gave the law, you know? So, and all through Lent, Now, we're not doing it today, but all through Lent, we've been beginning our services with what? Saying what? The Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. That's law, right? Like that's part of that, okay? And even Jesus talks about he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Okay, good. Yeah, that was actually a blank to be filled in. Thank you so much. Yes, okay. Yes, so he talks about how he came not to abolish, but to fulfill the law. And in some cases, in fact, many cases, Jesus turns up the volume on the law. So in the Ten Commandments, right, it says you should not commit murder. Jesus says you shouldn't even think about doing it. The Ten Commandments say don't commit adultery, and Jesus says you shouldn't even lust in your heart. Right? Like, yes. Yes, it is a big thing, and we will definitely not answer all of it today. I'm gonna adjust your expectation in there, but we are about to talk a little bit about that. So, the law found in Scripture, right? It's so tough. None of us can do it, right? None of us can do it. That's part of the point. That's part of what it means that Jesus came to fulfill it, because none of us can fulfill it. None of us can. The whole Old Testament is just a story of God's people very faithfully trying. Well, sometimes, but they're trying, right? They're trying. God's people are trying to fulfill the law that God gives them, and again, something kind of goes wrong. And they have to try again. And God extends grace again and again and again. And one of the ways that I understand Jesus' fulfillment of the law, this is like the new Revised Cameron version, okay, is one of the ways I understand Jesus fulfilling the law is that eventually, God keeps coming to his people. He's like, okay, I know, okay, all right, I gave you the law over here. You didn't do that. I told you not to worship idols. You made the idols. Okay, like all these things. And he keeps coming back again and again until finally he does what any parent does, and he says, I'm just going to come down there and fix it myself, right? I'm just going to have to come back there. You're fighting in the back seat, and my arm flapping back here is not enough to get you to stop. I'm going to stop the car, and I'm coming back there, That's kind of Jesus fulfilling the law, is God saying, okay, I'm going to come here, and I'm going to do all this stuff. And the stuff is what we celebrate this week in Holy Week, but that's getting ahead of my slides, which y'all know I'm always tempted to do. I always get ahead of my slides. But it's a huge question, right? But the law that we find in Scripture is so tough that the only reasonable response to taking it seriously is kind of desperation. It's this acknowledgement that we can't ever actually do it perfectly, right? Like if left to us, we can't fulfill it ourselves. But Jesus knew this. Jesus knew this too, and he assured us that what is impossible for us humans is possible with God. That what we can't do, Jesus can do, and in fact, he did do, and as I said, that's what we celebrate this week in particular. David Zoll writes that the seculosity of Jesusland takes root when law supplants grace as Christianity's final word. Or when we subvert the immortal hymn with our own additions. I once was lost, but now I'm found, so I better stay found, he writes. We start asking ourselves, if Jesus caught and embraced me when I fell off the ladder of life, then why does it feel like I'm on a new ladder now? Why do I get the creeping suspicion that I'm not a good enough Christian? The seculosity of Jesusland, he says, seeps in when church turns into yet another venue to establish our enoughness rather than to be the place where we receive it. Where we receive it. Do y'all hear that? Have y'all experienced that? I have experienced times and experiences of church, and I hope y'all haven't experienced this here, and I hope you won't if you have before. But I've had experiences of church where the law had supplanted grace as our final word. Like, I've been there. I've been to that church. I've been to that church where it was all about how I needed to look and what I needed to say or didn't say, and that was more important. Keeping up appearances was more important than finding God's grace in church on a Sunday morning. Well, maybe you hadn't. I'm seeing some heads being scratched. Good for you. If you've never been to that church, that's a terrible church to go to. Because we forget or we don't encounter God's grace in that space. Enoughness, as David Zoll points out, is not something that we can establish ourselves. It's something that we receive. Grace is a gift. It is given, not earned. That's like literally the core of the gospel, right? Okay. So he talks about how this can seep into the church, and he talks about how it seeps in most effectively. Seculosity seeps in most effectively to the church when we talk about transformation. Now, he does lay out, like with all these other things, spiritual and personal transformation is actually an integral part of the Christian faith, okay? So hopefully his distinction will become clear here. But he says, okay, so how does a faith that is supposed to root us in God's grace end up driving us to despair as we strive to be enough? How does this happen? Well, he points out that one of the chief ways that this can happen, as I said, is when we place an undue emphasis on personal transformation, treating our faith like just one more way to become a better or more fulfilled person, right? Like by coming to church, it's just this kind of bit of self-actualization, okay? It becomes less about what God has done for you and thus how you should live born out of joy. So like, yes, we should live transformed lives, but we should live transformed lives born out of a sense of joy because of what God has done for us and not out of a sense of obligation that we can earn what God has done. Does that make sense? Okay, good, okay. But this turns quickly into a kind of moralism that I was just describing that cares less about things like the state of your heart and it cares more about keeping up your outward appearances. This kind of moralism and the behavioral scorekeeping that it invites, right, because that's a very scorekeeping mindset. It's a very performanceism-based mindset. It's often the pitfall of more so-called conservative Christians and American evangelicals. This is at least where I've encountered it in my own life. This is every church I grew up in when they were at their worst. When they were at their best, they were great. And every church can fall into this. Now, liberal Christians have their own version of this that gets tied up in social action. Okay, so the way that you prove that you're enough is by how kind of much social action you do, how invested you are in your community, how often you serve other people. It becomes about the communal rather than the individual. But it's the same side, or it's a different side of the same coin, rather, right? It's still an attempt to justify yourself and how deserving you are of God's grace. Now, notice that both of these things, personal moral and or behavioral improvement and the righting of systemic moral ills, like both of those things are good things, and both of them have clear scriptural mandate. You are supposed to be transformed, right, in the living of your life. You are supposed to serve others. I mean, that's part of what Jesus literally commands us to do, is to associate with the marginalized and the downtrodden and the oppressed. He's like very clear about this. The Old Testament witness, very clear about this. The prophets, very, very clear about this. This is what got Israel into trouble on multiple occasions. You are supposed to care about your neighbor and serve others, right? But just as with all the other things that we've discussed so far in the study, the problem lies not with the things themselves, but in our ability to turn them into an idol, to use Annie's point from a few weeks ago. We turn them into the thing itself that's worth striving for, we turn them into the thing worth striving for and forget that God is really at the center. Not us or our own actions, but God's action. And our actions are an outgrowth of God's action. Yes? Oh, yes. Okay, so yeah, the question is about, on that third bullet point, so in the Episcopal Church, we have what can sometimes be referred to as high church churches and low church churches. How many of you are familiar with these terms? Okay. Oh, that's a lot of people in here. Okay. Huh? That's right. High and crazy, low and lazy. Yeah. And everybody will associate one with a better or a worse side. So these terms, I will tell you, they've become less descriptive over time. So they traditionally, when these terms first started to appear, they referred to very specific things. So a low church congregation not only had, because of course they originate in England, right? So a low church congregation also had certain views of the sort of role of the relationship between the church and the state, and a high church person had different views about that and how those two things came together. Now they mostly just refer to a liturgical style, okay? So if you talk about someone being low church, you like wearing cassocks, surplices, you don't really like the fancy vestments, you don't chant a lot, you don't have a lot of liturgical ornamentation, and the very thought of incense will make you pass out, okay? Like, that's low church. And that tradition in the United States is associated a lot with places like Virginia. Virginia is typically a very low church diocese, and therefore the seminary that happens to be located in Virginia also has an association as being a low church seminary, where many of your former rectors were trained. Not I, as it were. And then high church, that's smells and bells is what we refer to, right? You like the big vestments, you like the chanting, you like all the stuff, the liturgical ornamentation. That's mostly how it has, what it's come to mean now, right? And then in the middle, there's something called broad church, which is what it sounds like. It's like kind of embracing of both. I went to seminary at Sewanee, as many of you know, and we like to call ourselves prayer book Catholic, which is another way of saying, it's just another way of being persnickety, honestly. It's trying not to fall on the spectrum between the two. It's very presumptuous. It says that we know what the prayer book really is like, and that's what we are doing. And all these other seminaries are caught up in arguments about style and whatever, but we know what it really is about. Anyway, I will say that the 79 prayer book that we use Sunday after Sunday, right, is influenced really heavily by an Anglo-Catholic renewal movement in the late 1800s called the Oxford Movement. And so things like celebrating communion every single Sunday, if you grew up in the Episcopal Church at a time when that was not normal, right, and you didn't do that so often, that was an innovation of the 79 prayer book because it was influenced by this sort of Anglo-Catholic revival that said, no, actually, communion is a central act of worship, and we should do it as many times, all the time, as we possibly can. And so your standard Episcopal Church is kind of more on the higher church end of things, but you do still find some low church places, for sure. But that doesn't really map on as much to this kind of divide that's described there. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, although you certainly find this, you certainly find this dynamic playing out in different ways. An example that Zoll gives in the book that I don't put here, but, there's a tendency amongst some sort of like very, again, socially active, kind of perhaps in some ways more politically progressive Episcopalians will say things about whatever issue is going on in the world, they'll post online, well, if you don't hear this address from the pulpit, you need to find a different church this week, or whatever, right? And that's the kind of thing that Zoll mentions in the book as being, this is when seculosity gets in the way of the faith, right? And then you find some places where it's like, oh no, what's happening in the world should absolutely never somehow infect the pulpit. As if like somehow we're hermetically sealed off from the world. That's absolutely not right either, right? Our faith absolutely informs the way that we live. So anyway, Zoll's point is that we have to be kind of on guard about these dynamics in this way, but you certainly see them play out. Okay, so this is the major pitfall that he outlines for us of how this can start to get into the church. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Oh, okay, we're doing okay, still on time. What do we do about it? Okay, so first, I'm just going to put these up here again, boop, so I don't have to worry about them. I think that's all. I don't want to hit it again and then make them zoom away. So first, we have to stop thinking that our doing is what we have to do. What do we do about it? Well, the very question, which is a question that Zoll asks, it's the title to the conclusion of the book, is actually a misdirection, because the entirety of the book should have informed us by now that the idea or assumption that it's something that we do is already getting us off base a little bit. And he tells a story. He says that it all has to do with riptides. He tells a story about his father-in-law who almost died once when he got caught in a riptide and pulled underwater. It was at the beach. David Zoll talks about how he has to tell every one of his kids this at some point. It's like a rite of passage. So, his kid gets old enough, they go to the beach, and he has to tell the story of when Grandpa almost died in the riptide. Okay, so he's recounting this. And he tells the story, and then he writes, the key, as it turns out, is not to resist when you're caught in a riptide, but to go with the flow. No joke, he says. Instead of exerting yourself, you need to allow the current to take you out to sea, and the tidal forces will settle after a minute or two, and it'll dump you in a safer spot. And so your life in this moment depends on you letting go of control. He says a similar dynamic applies to the seculosity in which we are all currently drowning. Our attempts to engineer our own salvation always backfire, and they do so dramatically. When our initial strokes get us nowhere, instead of reevaluating or giving up, we start paddling in a different direction with the same results. Right? We keep kicking and kicking and kicking, and we are just wearing ourselves out, but the riptide is always stronger. And so, what do we need? Not what do we do, but what do we need? He says, is a religion of grace. He says a religion of grace must be received, as we said, right? Received rather than constructed. The gifts that we give ourselves don't hold a candle to the ones that truly come from an outside party, especially the ones that come by surprise. This is why the historical element of Christianity, that Jesus lived and died and rose again, isn't arbitrary, but is essential. Without the visceral yet well-attested events of Christ's passion, the announcement that we, quote, have been justified through faith and therefore we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, end quote, would not find the same traction in human affairs, and certainly not 2 millennia later, he says. So how do we ensure that our faith in Jesus does not start to become a religion of our own self-justification, but of God's grace freely given? Well, David Zoll offers a few ways, and I've kind of summarized them here. The first way is that we need to speak about death more often, he says. He writes that faith as a means to personal or social improvement would take a back seat to the more transcendent and eternal elements of capital R religion, of which there are many, if we talk more about death. Such a Christianity wouldn't simply talk about God, but would talk to God, he says. And I think there is a way in which God puts things in perspective. But I do think there is a way in which death puts things in perspective for all of us, right? There's a way in which death, for instance, makes our relationship to our busyness and how much we work and are striving, it puts that into a different perspective. It puts our parenting into a different perspective. So as morbid as it is, I think David Zoll's onto something there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we need to follow Christ's lead by focusing our attention on human motivations rather than just on human behaviors. It's his way of saying we need to focus on issues of the heart as much as we do issues of our hands, right? Like what we're doing. He writes, this means it would remember its own counsel, it being the church. The church would remember its own counsel that each of us, whether we're in the pews or not, is in bondage to forces beyond our control, whether they be inherited or assumed, or some combination thereof. None of us are free agents making healthy decisions, and any message that addresses us as such will prove no more than a clanging cymbal. Everyone you meet is in some kind of pain. They're a swimmer caught in a riptide, sometimes a riptide of their own making, he writes. That's right. But we are, right? All of us are in a riptide of our own making. There's a quote, I've seen it variously attributed to many different famous figures on the internet, so I honestly don't know who actually said it, but it's something about how we should be kind to each other because we're all in a hard place, basically. You don't know each other's struggles. Could have been said by Plato, could have been said by Jesus, could have been said by Gandhi, I don't know, okay? But everybody, Abe Lincoln probably said it, who knows? But I see it all the time on the internet, but it is true. It is true. We are all going through something, each and every one of us, every day. And it's one of the reasons why we need to be gentle with ourselves and with one another. We're all caught in a riptide. Sometimes we created it, and sometimes we didn't, but we're all caught in one. And then the third thing is this. He writes that we need to be Christ-centered, which, he writes, sounds like a no-brainer. But what I mean, he says, is that it won't be consumer or church-centered. As one of my favorite theologians is fond of saying, he says, you can tell that the church has nothing of substance left to say when it starts talking primarily about itself. I think that's a good quote. The church has nothing of substance left to say when it starts talking primarily about itself. Instead, a religion of capital G, grace, would hold to Jesus Christ as the central revelation of who God is, and the cross as the central revelation of who Christ is. Not just in terms of sacrificial love, but in terms of law-fulfilling righteousness imputed to non-transformed sinners like you and me. For this reason, a grace-centered Christianity would not balk from heralding at full volume and without our fingers crossed the good news that nothing that needs to be done hasn't already been done. That nothing that needs to be done hasn't already been done. And this is where we end. So he concludes by summing the whole book up like this. That the ultimate trouble with seculosity doesn't have anything to do with soulmates or smartphones or tribalism or workaholism or even our compulsive desire to measure up. The common denominator is the human heart, he says, yours and mine, which is to say, the problem is sin. And sin, he reminds us, is not something that we can coach ourselves out of. Sin is something from which we have to be saved, right? It's this idea, right? If it's up to us to do it, we won't be able to do it. So, again, I referenced these riptides earlier, and he comes back to this story. He references his father-in-law who almost drowned because he got caught in the riptide. And he ends the whole book by returning briefly to the story, and he says that, his father-in-law relaxed into the current, but he writes that only kept him alive long enough to be dragged out into the Atlantic. Yet it was there, he says, in the overwhelming expanse of sea, bereft of hope, that his father-in-law ran into some man in flippers who was swimming past, likely training for a triathlon or some such thing, David Zoll writes. This angel of a deep water enthusiast swooped in, hauled him to shore, and then revived him. And that's why he is alive today, David Zoll writes. He was rescued. He was rescued. And so, friends, the condition that describes all of us is the one I think we've just been outlining. We're all floating in this overwhelming expanse of sea, often bereft of hope. And no amount of our own striving, no matter how hard we try, no amount of us kicking against the current, will ultimately get us back to shore. And if anything, we'll just find ourselves worn out and sinking, maybe even drowning. But what we celebrate this week, right? I mean, this is why actually I thought this was a good Lenten study, is it ends up right where we find ourselves in Holy Week. What we celebrate this week, Jesus' death and resurrection, that is our rescue. It's a reminder that it is not what we do, that there is nothing we can or could ever do, but what God has already done that makes all the difference in our lives. And that's really all there is to say. So, we do have some discussion questions in the last few minutes that we have. As we end up here in Holy Week. I've got them all on one slide, and we'll take them one at a time today. But I'd be interested to know, yes, yeah. Yeah. Okay, good, okay. Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, yeah, yes. Yes, okay. That's a really important point. That's like, most of the Protestant Reformation hinges on that point, actually. Yeah, so... Yes, yes. Yeah, so, okay, so Julie, this is so good. This is so good, yes. Yes. So the idea of Jesus fulfilling the law. I think oftentimes, and I can actually think of sometimes maybe where I've been guilty of preaching this too, is it's really easy to preach it as if the way that you fulfilled the law is that it needed to be fulfilled for God, right? But God is perfect. God doesn't need anything. That's part of the miracle of creation, is that something exists when God doesn't need anything to, right? Like that's part of what makes it wondrous. Is in Genesis it tells us that God kind of made humanity for us to be in communion with God, but God's perfect. He's chilling out there with the Trinity, 3 in 1, perfect community for all time, right? Doesn't need us, wanted us, which is a good place to start. But the reason that we need to fulfill the law isn't to fulfill it because God needs it in some way, right? Jesus didn't fulfill it that way. Jesus didn't fulfill the law to God. Jesus fulfilled the law on our behalf, if that makes sense. Fulfilled our ability to need to fulfill it. Because I think we're conditioned, we always see ourselves at a deficit. Right? Like, I just think that's part of our human nature, is because we know that we can never be enough on our own, we therefore feel that we're always at a deficit. We're always making up for our mistakes. We're always, we're always in need of having to confess our sins because we're always doing them. You know what I mean? Like that's, and so because of that, I think it's easy for us to feel like that's a burden we have to fulfill, right? That we have to do. And that part of what Jesus did was like remove the burden of having to fulfill it, as if we ever could. But part of the gospel is we can't ever. We can't. That's right. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Hey, not bad. Not bad at all. Well, this is also, though, I'll bring up Paul again, right? So we reference Paul's thing about, like, I know what I should be doing, but I still do what I hate anyway in Romans 7. But Paul has to deal with this question a lot with, especially the Corinthians. The Corinthians are all about, because they feel like, okay, Jesus came so that actually we don't have to live morally at all. Right? Like, the good news of the gospel to them, or at least to some of them, seemed to be, based on what Paul is saying to them, it seemed to be, we don't have to live morally upright lives in any way because Jesus did all that for us, so we can do whatever we want. And it's like, yes. And Paul's like, no, actually, not right. And you can actually see Paul kind of struggling through how to thread this. And it is a fine line between saying we should, this is the trick, right, with that personal and spiritual transformation piece that David Zoll talks about in his book, actually, is we should be transformed in the light of the good news of the gospel, right? As Mickey, you just said, right, like, if this has been done for us, that should motivate us to live differently, right? Like, we should live different lives. But at the same time, we can't. And so Mickey, as you just said as well, right? But we try. We keep trying, right? And that's literally the entirety of the Christian life, is what we say at baptism, right? Is I will with God's help. Is because we're just trying. I will do this thing. I will seek to serve Christ in all persons and respect the dignity of every human being, but I know I can't do that fully. I'm going to fail at that, so I will with God's help. Like, with God's help, I'll maybe do this a little bit. And we're always striving. But I think this is why Paul's, the brilliance of the fruits of the Spirit. I think this is one of those brilliant things, is because the fruits of the Spirit kind of help us to think about this, I think, in the right way. Which is that the fruits of the Spirit, fruits are just things that grow. Like fruits grow. You plant the seed, you water the seed, the plant comes up, and fruits spring forth from the plant. And I think that's how the sort of transformation in our lives should look, is that they sort of spring forth from us. They grow out of us if we're keeping like the soil tended and all that sort of stuff of our lives. Good fruits come out of that. I think part of what starts to produce bad fruit is when we're trying to be too self-conscious about it and it becomes this kind of law-based thing. And then all of a sudden the fruits that they're, instead of being, because how, are you really being like gentle or peaceful or kind if you're like doing it aggressively to be self-righteous? We all know those kind of people, right? We've kind of experienced those people who like they're in their attempt to do this Christian life properly, they're so caught up in displaying those fruits of the Spirit, they actually end up kind of, I don't know, it doesn't feel very peaceful, kind, gentle, or self-controlled. You know what I mean? It starts to get twisted a little bit. And so I think, Paul starts to really get into his stride when he talks about the fruits of the Spirit. That's the way that these things in personal transformation should kind of show forth from our lives, is that like if we are rooted in Christ and the good news of his gospel, then all of a sudden our lives will bear fruit. But if we are trying to achieve it somehow, we're not rooted in the good news of the gospel and the fruit dies and falls off the tree, right? Something like that. But it's a big question. It's a big question. And kind of gets at this second question on this slide, right? Why do you think people feel not enough? There's a lot of reasons why we feel not enough, and I think it's mostly this acknowledgement that whatever goalposts we set for ourselves, we know ourselves we cannot achieve. And so it drives this cycle of not feeling enough, not feeling enough. Okay, we've got just a couple more minutes. Are there any questions on this, or any other questions? We don't have to answer these. These were just questions that I pulled out of the discussion guide. Yeah.
The second bullet that you just touched on, I think God is showing us, I need to remind you just to focus on me.
Yes, yeah. Yes. Yeah, that kind of, that's really good. Yeah, that we need to, yes, that through adversity we often, those can help us refocus, adverse times in our lives. It's actually part of my sermon for today, so there we go. But I will say this, so that actually kind of triggered a memory for me. And I don't even remember who it was now. It was maybe, again, because I spend too much time on the internet, it was probably just somebody who posted this somewhere. But I think it actually sums it up really good, Julie, and this is where we'll end today, about this relationship between the gospel as being something God does versus the gospel starting to shift into something we need to do. This person wrote this analogy. He was like, the gospel should be for us more akin to you getting a call from an attorney saying that you have received an unimaginable inheritance, and less a call from an employer saying you've just got your dream job. And I think that's a really good distinction, right? That the gospel is more about getting a phone call saying you have received an unimaginable inheritance from somebody maybe you don't even know, right? But now you have it, and it's life-changing, absolutely life-changing, and not getting a call and saying you've just gotten your dream job, right? And that's kind of the difference, that so long as God is the center of the gospel, which God is, then we're keeping it straight. But the second we start to get into, if it starts to be us focused, that's where we tend to go wrong, right? All right, well, thank you, guys. We're going to end in prayer and then get set up to do some church and to talk more, again, about all of these things, but in the context of our liturgies this week. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Eternal and gracious God, I do thank you so much for the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ. I thank you that even in our strivings to be enough, we can rest in the fact that we are already enough because you are enough, not because we can ever be enough ourselves. I pray that as we journey together through this next week, that our hearts would be open to continually receive that gift of that good news, that we would hear it afresh, and that we would be changed and transformed by that glorious mystery of the empty tomb. We pray that you would be with us today, that you would guide us and guard us in all that we do, for it's in your name that we pray. Amen.